I'm Brian Parks. Welcome to the first episode of Conversations in the Harvey White House. We are in the what we use as the dining room, and we are seeing the front door as well as the atrium. My guest today for our first show is Jon Myers, composer and musician. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great. It's great to be here.
We've been waiting a long time for this show. We've been planning it for almost 12 hours, so it's great to just sort of finally have our these plans finally come into fruition. It's sort of can't believe it's really going to happen, and then it is.
And it really does. And here you are.
It's only 12 hours. It's only like barely even half a day. So what are you working on?
What am I working on? Well, I've been thinking about the idea of flocking, of flocks of birds and schools of fish, and how these things kind of move together. And I've been trying to figure out ways to, in music, to kind of think about these kind of flocking patterns. So I wrote a piece that didn't go very well, and I'm trying to make a better one. But I think part of the issue I've been running up against is I'm really looking for very precise contours of tempo that I don't think humans can play.
Contours of tempo, like increases in speed over time?
Increases in speed over time.
Or decreases?
Yeah. Accelerations. And so right now I'm kind of coding out the algorithm for it, and I think I'm going to try and realize it one track at a time on guitar.
Mm-hmm. When you say flocking or schooling, I'm thinking of an entity that is made up of discrete parts, but obviously combined to be one entity, and have motion, have movement, have inertia in a direction, and then move from one point that then follows, like a pivot point. Am I perceiving the kind of correct idea?
I think so. Oh, why? Why, thank you.
Thank you, Janet. This is a hairy crab oolong introduced to me by adjunct professor of music at Wesleyan University, David Nelson. To David?
To David. Well, I think you're close. I don't quite see a pivot going on. I see, the way I think of it is definitely separate parts. So maybe, let's say there are 16 separate objects. And at times you can notice each one individually. At other times you can only notice the shape of the whole flock. And ideally, the transition between noticing individual objects and the whole shape of all the objects together will be gradual, and you won't quite be able to tell where the transition is occurring.
So talk to me about how this might be done for one person at one instrument, like a keyboard instrument, or is that a possible medium for it, or is it not?
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, I basically think of it as one note that repeats.
Mm-hmm.
Each object is one note that repeats at different speeds. So for this piece, it will be a series of decelerations and then pauses. Another deceleration, but each time it decelerates, it will be slightly slower. And the way that these decelerations are going to be stacked on top of each other, they'll be interacting in a near ratiometric fashion.
Single notes per object in the group, or single note as the flock? Everyone is on the same note.
Each single note for each object.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference between the different objects would be different notes.
In this particular case, I'm thinking of like a piano, and I'm imagining 8 of my fingers on the piano or something,
Mm-hmm.
which I actually think is possibly controllable, probably not. But for maybe certain performers, it might be. But I'm wondering, are they all decelerating, but they're decelerating at different paces of deceleration?
They're all decelerating globally, everything is decelerating together at the same rate. But individually, each object will decelerate at different speeds throughout.
Different rates of deceleration.
Different rates, yes. So like there will be, let's say, object 1 on a large scale will have 16 separate
Attacks?
It'll have 16 separate large scale attacks, and within each of those attacks, let's say it'll have 16 notes that are played.
Mm-hmm.
Object 2 will have 17 large scale attacks and have 17 notes that are played within each attack.
How is this not, or not, how is this not? Is this, so let's say, if I make it even more basic, if I have 10 objects, the first one plays 1 note. Yeah, the second one plays 2 notes. Each one is half as long as the first one was. So a basic phase structure.
Right.
Yours is different or this idea is different because it's not a phase, it's a rate of change. But does it still adhere to the same principles?
Well, so the first piece that I made that's like this was a simpler phase relation.
Mm-hmm.
So you had 16 of these sound objects, and globally the entire thing was slowing down, and each one was ratiometrically related to the next one down. So it was as if you were hearing 8 over 9 over 10 over 11, etc. But then each one would kind of go from pianissimo forte to pianissimo and be silent for a time. Mm-hmm. So they would overlap in somewhat interesting ways, although not interesting enough, I think.
Not interesting enough. How much was that interesting enoughness dependent on correct execution?
I think a lot of it was. I mean, it was very tricky to play. There was a group, about 16, mostly wind and horn players and some vocalists.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to get something close to this effect to happen with this group without any click tracks, I decided to quantize their playing to the closest eighth note and have it conducted. So for the players, it was tricky just to follow this conducting.
Just for me for a second, quantize, so you're quantizing in notation, meaning you are sort of rounding off edges to get the general idea, but without the necessarily exactitude of a particular phase.
Exactly. So at the beginning of the piece, when things are very fast, it seemed like it was going to be a Hocket piece, you know, da 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 da. These things were kind of overlapping, and as it goes on, as the meter that we're hearing stays constant, but the meter that is expressed in the flock is slowing down. You get closer and closer to the actual, to actually being able to hear the relationships that are going on.
I'm trying to think about the original idea of flocking. So in this case, this is a flock that's like coming to repose together. And is that sort of what's happening? I mean, they're together. Like, how is the flock analogy maintained?
It's a bit of a loose analogy.
Okay.
It's more, what I'm taking from it is the differential, you know, this idea of objects and the gestalt of the entire thing together, and how they play with each other, how you identify each as their own thing, and how you identify them as one group together.
If you're just joining me, my guest is Jon Myers. He's a composer who lives in New York City. He's originally from the greater Boston area. He took his Bachelor of Arts degree in music at Wesleyan University. He garnered awards throughout that journey. And then he took his master's at Mills College in Oakland. I'm switching gears a little bit. In a 5-year span, you've been on 2 coasts, and you've been a student on both coasts, and you've been an independent musician and independent contractor on both coasts. You've been involved with music scenes, and then you've been involved in music departments in those scenes. And can you talk a little bit about how you perceive your experience moving through those different kind of domains, those different realms?
Sure. In general, I think the Academy is a very safe place and a very comfortable place to be. And the community that kind of arises there, and this is especially true at Mills, you kind of forget that what you're doing is strange because everyone around you is doing something close to it. So when you're in this bubble, you can really kind of, the thing that you feel like you have to push against is what the other people around you are doing. And so I think there's this kind of group radicalization that happens in that space. And then once you're out of it, you suddenly realize, like, even just, you can kind of come back a little bit and you'll still be considered pretty radical compared to what's going on.
Well, to whom? Like, who are you dealing with?
Well, I mean, just, if you get a show, if you book a show at pretty much any venue, and you try and explain what you're doing, or there are just, I've found there to be like many modes of music that just aren't talked about, aren't really thought about. by most people coming to the concert on a given day.
I wonder about, is it that people would articulate themselves with the idea of a radicalization, or would they perceive what's going on as, for lack of a better word at the moment, incoherence? Meaning, not incoherence, so just another language. So, I don't know that the music that I do, for instance, would be called radical by anyone, but it might be sort of, it might seem inessential to people, like, or sort of, I don't know what it might seem, but I don't think they would use the term radical. I just don't think that they would necessarily understand the cues of the language. Do you think it's a comment, like?
Well, I think it's, I guess I'm more trying to express, there would be a lack of interest, perhaps, in the general public. And I think that has to do with the lack of, with a very basic, or not basic, but a very specific understanding of what music is and what it can be.
Okay, so is it about what music is in terms of its contents, or is it about what music is? And if I'm disattributing unfairly, that's, definitely point that out, but is it about the contents of the music, or is it about, like, say, function of music? So, for instance, if you have someone who goes to concert musics in halls and they hear 19th century, they hear common practice music from Euro-America, I guess that was sort of redundant, and then they hear mid-20th century music from Euro-America, but it's just, for lack of a better word, it's dissonant. Or it's perceived as dissonant to them, so they might, that sort of thing where, like, it takes people aback. But it's nothing has really been altered in terms of maybe the function of music, in that you're going to a concert where performers who have a certain virtuosity or a certain cachet publicly perform for you. You're not, you're not an essential component of the experience, other than as a listening audience member. Perhaps you're essential because you're paying. I mean, but other than that, there's not going to be a ton of a lot of the codes are not different. So once you say get through the, like, slight language change from some sort of archaic linguistic code or some lexical scope to this slightly newer one, you're probably going to be okay. Which is why I do think that people who are, quote, exposed to modern Euro-American music end up generally liking it. Or they'll say things like, it's okay, a little bit of it's okay, just, and that's why I think you have this concert programming paradigm that it's symphony orchestras that I haven't really seen a change in since I was a kid, where you have Beethoven or his ilk, and then you have, I don't know, late 19th century and that ilk, and then maybe a modern piece thrown in that itself is from a kind of established canon. I'm wondering if what you're doing is actually challenging not just the contents of music, but actually the why of it, the function of it.
Right. Well, I would actually challenge I guess I wasn't even thinking of this audience of concert-going people as being, that seems to me a pretty much a minority of the people in general who are interested in music as it is. I'm thinking more of, when I talk to people and try and describe them, a composer, for them, music might, to see live music might mean to go to a rock concert,
right,
or to see a DJ. And, they ask, oh, so are you writing for films? That's kind of the one area. It's like, no, I'm hoping to write music that will be played in a concert for someone to hear. I don't know if it's a challenge to any kind of dominant paradigm, as much as just almost like a return to a paradigm
Okay, which paradigm?
of sitting down and listening to music.
Live music.
It's live music, and not like dance, not necessarily like dancing to a rock.
Dancing, eating, or talking.
Yeah. Not being entertained at a club at night.
Okay, but so let's say that the concert going, the imaginary concert going group that I was sort of invoking is the group then that you're sort of trying to think about.
Mm-hmm.
See, I would say that, for instance, and this is a delicate question because I'm going to throw in a term that might not be agreed upon with our viewing audience or each other, but virtuosity. So I would say that going to a symphony orchestra, that audience, they're not coming to see non-virtuosic music.
Mm-hmm.
And their assessment of virtuosity is going to be, I'd say, physical, as opposed to psychical. Presenting a Tom Johnson score or an Alban score might require very little traditional facility, but might require a tremendous amount of concentration, an ability, possibly a virtuosic ability to get people to listen in a particular way and tune their ears and then maintain that state, which I'd argue is kind of virtuosic. But that, I don't think that's the same audience. I would say that, I don't know what audience it's closer to. I'd say this general audience who listens to music digitally in films perceives music as existing in these realms only. And the concert-going audience, I don't think I'm saying that that's not the audience I'm perceiving you playing for. Even when you're doing gigs, I'm perceiving that there's another audience that is sort of interstitially present and also doesn't find what you're doing that clear to them. Like, who exactly, when you're playing concerts, so you have a few concerts coming up.
Right. Well, I think part of the thing is I found myself at this point in time to be kind of divided, I think, into three, what some people might consider three like very divergent practices.
Mm-hmm.
So the first being, writing these kind of algorithmic pieces that will, sometimes be performed, by chamber ensembles, and sometimes be realized as recordings.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I've also been working with electronic music and performing analog electronics. So, I see those things as kind of being they require a similar mindset on my part in putting together a system. Mm-hmm. However, very different groups of people might be interested in listening to the music. And then there's also kind of free improvisation in that whole area.
Mm-hmm.
So I see these things as related, but I think you're unlikely to find all that many audience members who are going to be interested in all three of those types of music.
Do you consciously change your posture in performance at those discrete venues?
Like how I'm labeling myself? You mean?
I mean to like how you're performing. Like I perform differently when I'm playing an organ piece in front of a church audience.
Right. I think so. I mean, I think I would perform like some kind of minimalist piece on percussion, the same way I would perform analog electronics, mm-hmm. Which is to try and not move and not let my emotions get too involved.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a free improvisation gig, I think I probably wouldn't be as refined, or wouldn't be thinking about that at least.
Mm-hmm. And I should be careful because organ music is pretty much acousmatic, which is a term very much revived by music theorist Brian Kane at Yale University, whose book Sound Unseen is probably quite good, or is a good way to talk more about the concept of acousmaticity. I have cited it without reading the whole book. And if that makes me guilty of a larger sin, then I'm guilty of that larger sin. I don't think it makes me guilty. I mean, I read the section that I was citing, so I don't... My point is that I don't mean posture in terms of exactly literal performance style. I sort of mean like in the way that I try to lead listeners to particular things through how I choose to phrase things. So you said like you had tried some gigs, or you were at this place where they kind of, you said it didn't feel like, it felt to you that they didn't think it was loud enough.
Right.
So
like this Thursday I'm playing at a noise night at a bar in Brooklyn. And I think there's noise and metal bands on the bill, and then I'll be playing analog electronics as well. So I guess this falls under the paradigm of noise. But I think that's also kind of that's like a self-defeating term. So, people who are interested in electronic music and want to call it noise, they might not be coming from the same place that I am, but I think they might still be able to appreciate what I'm doing. And they might not be in it for the same reasons that I am. They might want, to just hear the harshest possible thing, or hear something loud that'll, give them a jolt.
are the other groups or people that play in these nights, do they have a more consistent sonic profile?
I'm not completely sure. I mean, I think a couple of them, tour as metal bands. So I would imagine that. I mean, I don't want to generalize. Who knows what else?
Yeah, I haven't heard enough.
Who knows what
I mean, of course,
the lives these people have.
as we know, if you're deeply in a genre, you can hear only differences between groups. Whereas if you're kind of on the outside, it sounds like one sound.
Right.
So I think that when I really think about, say, electronic music performance, I've heard very few performances that I would argue that I would categorize as being similar to each other. Obviously, that's a medium where, in a certain way, there's endless internal variation. I'm also sort of hearing composers do electronic music, so their motivation is to differentiate themselves from other composers doing electronic music. They're not trying to, say, get a crowd pumped, excited, enraged, what have you. So again, I think motivation here is like has a real correlation to actual aesthetic artifact.
Right. Well, I mean, it is a little tricky, and I'll try and perform the same way I would for a group of metal fans as I would for a group of people at Mills or wherever. And I think that'll start with my tone on the stage, and I think I'll ask people to sit down. That's what I did last time, and just listen.
I might be the wrong person doing interviews like this in a sense because I come from a tradition of sort of a personal tradition of performance in all fora. Like that's just how I think humans are supposed to go about their business. When you go to the grocery store, you're in a new performance state. That's just, I think, what that's how I consciousize it. That's how I perceive it. That's how I become conscious of it, or how I understand consciousness in those spaces is like a type of performance. So, you're saying, well, I'm the same. It's really the same thing in each state. Which I think someone like Cage would also agree. I think part of Cage's great, one of his great legacies is this idea of like himself as a river through many terrains. Affected by the terrain, like, he becomes faster, if it's tighter, and maybe he smooths out when it's wider, but it's very much the same body of water, the same body of work, the same body of consciousness and conception. But I also think of Cage as someone who is very consciously performing himself.
Sure.
I think there's an interesting paradox there. because he was performing this sort of perfect human, this perfectly consistent human. And maybe it's not a paradox. I mean, what do you think about that aspect of Cage? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I mean, I would agree with what you're saying about his his tone in lectures and in conversations, and kind of the gentleness, and he certainly seemed, at least in what he said, seemed to think of his music and his lectures and writings all as kind of one output, and also probably his, cooking dinner or walking down the street as one object.
I remember when I did it, there was a place in Atlanta called the Drunken Unicorn, which was part of an underground club called MJQ. And I still think of like the phrase modern jazz quartet when I wrote. So it was a club, and then I guess they built, or they had this space, they sort of turned into like a music venue on the side. So I remember when I did a gig there, it was with my virginal as an opening act, and I did a phase for 35 minutes, and then I stopped, and that was it. And I felt very much like this was me, and this was all I could really think to do at this space. But I was also very aware that it was something that is just not done in the space, and so therefore a lot of what I was doing I was getting for free. In other words, the effect of what I was doing was basically extra musical. I mean, if people listened to the chords and the rhythms and the artifacts that were coming out of the instrument, that's not bad, but all that was really happening was like, oh, this guy's playing a period instrument in this punk stage, and he's not changing what he's doing, and there's nothing else that's going to happen. That was basically the message. So I would say that that was a moment where, I'm not saying you're working at odds that much with, let's say, the prevailing thing, but I would say that in terms of the internal group radicalism, that was a space that I was constantly trying to understand, say at Wesleyan with other composers, is we have this group that has this identity, and in the group we're trying to distinguish ourselves.
Sure.
And when I caught myself as the goal, it was always a little jarring. Because I don't think it's the wrong goal. In fact, I don't think it's escapable. I think it's in there. Did you find that refined the way you wrote music? Do you find that it affected the way you wrote music, or was it just sort of this in-the-air byproduct?
Yeah, I mean, I think it did refine things, and it also, it also, to hear other people's takes on what you were doing helped to kind of make it clear. It helped to make it clear to me, at least, what it was that I was after. And then once that group dissolves, it's kind of like you're floating in a, you've refined your tastes to such a highly distilled place, and you're kind of floating in it feels like you're floating in a tank way far away from everything else.
And then you have to re-enter?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. I just moved back to New York City, and I've been going to a lot of concerts and trying to see what is happening. Obviously, there's an incredible diversity of things happening, and I don't quite see where I fit in, and I don't think that'll ever be clear. Yeah.
So I'm trying to get a couple more questions that I have in mind. I'm going to put this one there just so we can maybe come back to it, but the form of this is going to get a little disjunct. I think that the self-performance issue, I don't want to quite leave. I think it's maybe a little too easy. It's a little too sexy to talk about composers' personalities. But I do think every conversation I have with composers, we do end up talking about our mentors and in outsized ways, either in adoration or in criticality. But it does so happen that Wesleyan composers that went during my era were Alvin Lucier, Ron Quivela, Neely Bruce, Anthony Braxton. And to think that those men aren't aware of their selves would be lunacy. And maybe they are. I mean, Wesleyan is an outlying place. Well, I'm sure every community thinks that, but Wesleyan just tends to have this counter-academic academia to itself, which is maybe a facade, because they're also very old world in many ways. But those four guys, I mean, there's no question that they know that they are themselves in public. For Alvin, he's certainly not afraid to put it into pieces. I mean, even though I think he's the least kind of demonstrative one of them, Anthony's pieces are not about himself, but certainly. So I guess I want to just put that in the air, maybe come back to it, because I want to ask you about other composers you've met and whether you feel that they have that kind of awareness, or if it comes out of maybe ecological realities, like Wesleyan isn't in a city and isn't connected to other institutions, so you could end up getting kind of stir crazy. And what I wanted to ask was, getting back to one of your pieces, so you were telling me about an array of intervals that you like exploring. So tell me, do you explore them when you're, say, improvising music?
Not really. I try not to be too conscious about those types of choices.
Can you describe the intervallic?
Sure. I mean, this is something that I used in a piece last fall, and that's kind of I developed it for that. But it's basically it's just stacks of a fourth followed by tritone, fourth tritone, fourth tritone. So 7 notes, and then you move up by a third and go
A major third?
Sorry, you move up by a major third and go tritone, fourth tritone, and you move up by a major third again, and go fourth tritone, fourth, and you end up getting these kind of really kind of crystalline chords. I mean, they sound like Feldman chords, and that's what I was probably pretty obviously trying to rip off. But anyway, it's a nice. It allows you to kind of be in a sort of 12-tone space without really creating a row in the same kind of way. And the piece that I used it for, that was each instrument was kind of following their own little game like that, or little set of rules like that. And each instrument had some kind of pattern like that going on.
My dog is making really funny noises. That's the sound. So I don't have like someone tied up, it's like escaping.
Each of the 4 instruments followed some kind of pattern or set of rules like that, and then also each instrument had some kind of image. I've been thinking of them as images, but there's some kind of tuneful or some little moment that you hear immediately, and I think it makes you grab onto it as some kind of anchor. So the way I think of this piece is all these kind of sliding, overlaid processes, and then with anchor it's kind of stuck in between. So you're hearing at the moment to moment, you're hearing the clashes of these different patterns, and it's kind of coming out in a nice way. And then there's these anchors that kind of, to me at least, set it up in a real way and divide up the longer space. So it's like a 16-minute piece, and divide up the 16 minutes into these chunks that kind of allow you to reset every time you get to a new anchor or image, as I'm thinking.
Is this wheel?
No, this is called Contrivances.
Mhm.
I don't know if, I think I may have sent it to you. Maybe not.
Was it the one where you recommended listening to it over a cup of tea?
Yes.
Oh, then I did hear that one. It was very pleasant.
Oh.
I couldn't listen to it for more than a few minutes though, because I have trouble listening to recordings for more than a few minutes.
Hmm.
But I don't mean that it wasn't personal. I enjoyed what I heard.
Yeah.
I would enjoy playing that piece, I think, a lot. Just a quick question, the word anchor, you didn't use the word hook, because the word hook in music has a totally different connotation, but it is the same word in a way. Is it something that the listener helps to helps to route the listener?
I think so. I mean, at least at that time, or with that piece, I'm very interested in memory and how time gets choked up into different amounts, into different spaces. So let's say you have something that happens, and then we talk for a little while, and then all of a sudden, those two things, the two snaps are the same thing, and they kind of make a linkage in time, and they both break up what happened before them, and then they also make a connection to that next time that thing happens. So they both divide up time, and they create a grid or a tempo. So like all three of those, in a certain sense, it's 1, 2, 3 in a series, the same thing. And then if you have multiple of those kind of moments that are recognizable happening, then something you can kind of shift the temporality in a way
because you have this sort of useful object.
These objects that are they're like signposts, or they're like lights in the distance, and you're kind of using them to navigate through the space, the temporal space.
One form that I find, I don't know gamelan. I didn't really do song form in South Indian music. I really just did the Solkatu thing, which is its own very formal rigor. But one thing I always loved sort of experiencing or sensing, and I never could tell if it was how much they related to each other in terms of a hybrid, is the idea of a rondo form, right? Because rondo form is that in a much more pedantic way, where you have this musical element, and then you have episodes, right? And then you have that musical element, usually literally, or at least in a fragment that's very recognizable, and then you have another episode. So, the ritornello concertos of Bach and Vivaldi have these just, bam, we're back at, the rondo is like this way of like resetting the decks, clear the air, have a cup of coffee, bam, you're back. And then chavicor, especially slow chavicor and Ghanaian drumming, you have this turn, don't get, right? And like everyone gets to come back to that, the turn for the dancers. And then you have these episodes. And, I just loved when I was playing that, how it was like being in a 19th century Mozart rondo. There was like basically no difference in terms of the formal schematic and like what it did, what it was doing in the piece, and played by someone as artful as Abraham. Just how enjoyable that was. And just that you talking about it sort of reminds me of like how these things can. You're doing it in a very different way, in a much less heavy-handed way, or a much less like formally dependent way.
Well, I think it is similar, and I actually I'm trying to be heavy-handed with it, although I'm trying to have many of these anchor points happening kind of simultaneously around each other, so that I think so that hopefully instead of your entire listening power being pulled in one direction every time it happens, and having the entire focus of the piece kind of be based around that, you're kind of being pulled in many directions each time they happen, and so your experience of it can change depending on what you decide to get drawn towards when you're listening.
I think that kind of brings us back to one other point, which is this, I was saying the word heavy-handed, but someone who's watching ballet and drumming and dance probably would notice that. It would take many listens to hear that turn as identical to itself. It took me years. I'm sitting here acting like the audiences are idiots, but no, it took me years to realize that Abraham was what was going on.
For a while, I definitely thought, you have these cycles going on, and then he's up there kind of improvising.
Yeah.
And it's great.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
And I thought, Abraham was very, he was very gracious to me, I realized, because he wasn't gracious to everyone. Maybe he wasn't, but I thought I could improvise too. Such was my experience, was that, music is about breaking out and improvising, whatever genre you're in. So I was playing kagano parts. So for our listeners, our lay, non-Ghanaian drumming listeners, a kagano part in most pieces where it exists is sort of articulating the anacrusis aspect of a beat. So if a beat has a pulse, the kagano tends to bring into relief in some sort of equal way the other parts of that space. So da 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 or da 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 or even that one, I'm sorry. So that one actually does hit on some pulses, but it does not change. I should just mention that right now. It does not change, ever. Other stick drum parts do change. There's dialogue. That one does not change. And so I was playing a kagan part, but Abraham was so amazing that I was I just kind of wanted to show him that I appreciated it by interacting, and and he just sort of stopped playing, of course, and then laughed, right? And I was right in it and still didn't understand the language I was speaking, which is one of the great things about music, is you can participate in it without actually understanding the language you're speaking. Kind of like Judaism. But not really.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly why I brought that up. Oh, I guess this idea of... See, what's interesting about that piece you're describing is that in the piece is this sort of process of engagement. Right? It sounds like the piece has these elements that are designed, not just, they're musical, and they're also communicative with the listener.
Right. Well, I don't think the elements themselves hold any meaning, but I think something about the way that they divide up the space and allow for a temporality, and I think that's where the meaning might come from. And this is, maybe this is going way too general, but I think that's how meaning might be formed in general, by just divisions of space and how, seeing how different cycle lengths or different amounts of time might relate to each other.
So signposts themselves are meaningful.
Well, they create meaning. That's what I guess, yes.
They carve out meaning by delineating the space in a certain way.
Yes.
So I have kind of a final topic I'd like you to talk about, and then we'll wrap things up. That's okay. So again, my composerly interaction has been kind of dominated by the four composers I mentioned earlier, and Tom Johnson. I wish I was more worldly than that, but and then not lots, but sibling composers. You, Michael Winter, Andrew Smith. I'd say Larry Polanski is not a sibling composer. He would be on the mentor stage, but I don't know him as well personally. But his music has had a lot of presence in my process. My question is, so these composers, I just see them as indelibly related to their persona. Not always as consciously as maybe I tend to be, or as I'm aware of, but they are a certain way, and you can talk about them, and people have this they know what you mean when you talk about that person, which I guess is true of everybody, but these people happen to be cultural producers. And I'm wondering, you've obviously gotten to be with other composers over the last few years and teachers, and what are they like? Is it different? And my argument was that, okay, being at Wesleyan kind of did that to them, maybe. You were in places that were a little more cosmopolitan. Apologies to everybody. I know Alvin and Anthony get outside Middletown. I didn't mean to say it like that. I just mean that it was a very intense department. Okay, it was a crucible. That's all I meant.
Well, I think I don't think it's necessarily just about being locked in one location. I think everyone does end up being that way if they continue to work at something for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I think the fact that all the people you're talking about are like in their 50s or older might help.
That's true.
And I think like I see you as that way.
Mm.
Maybe you don't see yourself that way, but I see your personality and your output, at least what I've heard, as being kind of self-consistent, if that makes any sense.
Mm.
And I think that, so I think that is true. There's this, like the rule is like that people do want to have this kind of self-consistency, or their rule is that their output will all be very different, and that itself turns into a kind of self-consistency, if you know what I mean. Like I'm thinking of like Fred Frith here.
Okay.
He seems to consciously be doing very different things in a lot of his practices, and he's conscious of it. And I think, but his teaching methods and his kind of outlook, I think also, relate to that, or
Like his personality? Does his personality reflect that?
Yeah, or at least what he claims as his influences. He'll talk about, I was listening to Wagner this morning, or I was listening to Whale Song, or I was listening to Zeppelin. Whatever it is.
Sure.
Kind of all of them matter.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think that all these people that we're thinking of as mentors here have is a strong belief in their own sense of taste. And I think that can be tricky, and I know that at school I've been definitely pushed in a lot of directions, and it's been hard to, I think the more time you spend thinking about these things and listening to music and thinking about music, the more you're probably able to trust your own taste and really be sure that that's the thing that you really like. Because when you're a kid, you hear things and you might not, you hear Coltrane for the first time and you're like, oh, I don't know if I like that. And eventually you learn to like it, and then, at least this is my experience, you keep getting pushed kind of further out in this direction. I heard, the first times I heard atonal music, I was like, oh, that's not for me, I don't want to listen to that. And then years go by and suddenly they're, oh,
Well, the
that's
signposts,
just great.
the signposts become more recognizable.
I guess that's...
I mean, the text, which is at first just randomness, or is just as simple as you don't understand, takes on literal meaning. You know what it means. You can read it, you can hear it, you can understand it. I mean, I think exposure to any language, that language takes on meaning, and I don't mean symbolic meaning, or I mean like meaning. It has information in it,
Right.
Or I guess it becomes informatic more than meaningful. I would say that happened in my atonal music experience, in the Rashid Ali, John Coltrane experiences, was that I wanted to understand the language. I guess that's the thing, is you do have to have this point of like desire. Before we ran out of batteries, we were talking about, I was sort of maybe forcing in this idea of music as text, but I think there's some literal things there that I understand about it, which is that, I mean, your argument, not argument, but you're sort of saying this taste, this consistent have this consistent engagement with music, activity, composing, listening, interacting with musicians, does help to solidify and refine things like taste. And I'm also sort of just throwing in there that it's bizarre to me that the environment will begin to make itself meaningful by virtue of a deeper understanding of its content, its text, its textness. So like, for instance, it's weird to me, I have to say, when, I don't want to say exactly weird, but my relationship to hymns, which at first, 8 years ago, was a job. It was learning how to pump gas or run a cash register, like, has taken on a much different feeling because I know what the hymns do for people and the way they are supposed to, like, for instance, the pace of them, the way they're supposed to be paced, and the way the way you're trying to show breath, like, all these things have taken on a much odder sort of meaning. I don't want to say a deeper or more fulfilling meaning, just like I know what they mean in a different way. I understand the text more, I guess what I'm saying. But I didn't mean to necessarily take what you were saying, so that happens sometimes. We do have to wrap things up. I want to thank our guest, Jon Myers. Jon, can you tell us about, you have some performances coming up?
Yeah. I'm going to be playing, as I mentioned before, on this analog electronic instrument I've been working with over the last couple of years. It's 2 FM transmitters and 2 FM receivers and a mixer, and it feeds back. And sometimes the most exciting part is that when you move your body around the space, you can get it into these kind of pattern-like things where sounds are coming back and it's kind of jittery. Then as you move your body around the space, you can kind of interact without touching the mixer at all, and just have, however the electromagnetic waves are moving around the space. So I'm playing that at this noise night at the Cobra Club in Brooklyn on 2 nights from tonight.
Cobra Club, Brooklyn.
On Sunday afternoon, I'll be joining the Gamelan Kasumalaras, which is a Javanese gamelan based out of the Indonesian consulate in Manhattan. We'll be playing on the street on 68th Street, just east of Central Park, from 1 to 6 p.m. Just cutting on. I think there might be one dance piece with that as well. And then I'll be improvising with an old friend of mine, Andrew Jameson, who I went to school with in California. He'll be in town giving he's a very interesting composer. He grew up in a Baptist church, and he writes pieces and does improvisations that kind of interact with that area, and his deep background in playing that kind of music, and I'm going to be improvising with him as well.
Do you know people who in music concerts, especially ones with transparent acoustic spaces, say that they go, like, when something happens, they will sometimes go like, I'm one of those people, and Janet, I think, hates it. Janet's my spouse. Or she doesn't hate it, but I think she can't believe that she's married to someone who literally was like, like, yeah, and I do it in conversation too.
Well, it gets weird. I know people who go, ugh. I once went, ugh, at the end of an improvisation, and everyone thought that I had hated it, but it was an ugh of like, this is.
I do that when meals are put in front of me that look good. I'm like, ugh.
Yeah.
But I really do mean that. Like, that my life could reach this pinnacle of enjoyment, and but I do not like that I do that
in
conversation and in performance. And I'm pretty sure I do it without affectation. I'm sure I must have started doing it with affectation. I think it comes slightly from my mother, who's the kind of person who needs to state when the performance elicits emotion from her, she needs to say that. So she'll say bravo or brava at the end of a lot of concerts, and she says it very quickly so people hear her. She cries a lot. She clutches my arm. If the performer or writer is Jewish, she will say that. Like, it's written by a Jew. So I think it comes out of that tradition of just needing to, Conversations with Brian Parks comes to you live. I mean, it's not live because it's on the internet. I guess it'll be on the internet, but nothing is not happening live. Nothing is, am I saying it's happening live? It's happening.
If you're watching it, it's happening.
Right, but I mean, nothing is added later. Okay, so anyway, Conversations with Brian Parks. Do you want to come in around? You wanna walk through? We're gonna do a little walk through. This is Orion Simon Parks. Walk behind. Conversations with Brian Parks are recorded live at the Harvey White House in West Hartford, Connecticut. My guest today was Jon Myers. Thank you to John. Thank you to Janet Simone Parks for tea. Thank you to Orion Simon Parks. We'll see you next time.